Hello and welcome back to another episode of Cloud with Chris. You're with me, Chris Reddington, and we will be talking about all things cloud. Thanks for tuning in, and we're actually going to be starting with another of the series here of the Architecting in the Cloud one pattern at a time, and we're joined by a familiar face, or maybe not a face again, unfortunately, because we're still having those technical issues, but a familiar voice at least. We'll be joined by Peter Piper, who you may remember talked to us previously about the API economy. Going to be talking to us today about some relevant patterns in the API space that we may be using. So primarily we're going to focus on the backends for Frontends pattern, and then we'll see where the discussion takes us today. So again, if this content is useful, if you're enjoying this series and you're finding these topics relevant, please like, please subscribe, and please let other people know, because that is exactly why we've started this series and pushing out this content, because we're getting some great feedback from people on the value of this. So it really helps us just make sure we broaden that reach. So now that we've gone ahead and got all of those aspects out of the way, and I'm delighted to bring back that familiar face, voice, because as you know, we've got these technical issues. Peter, how are you doing, sir?
Hi, Chris. I'm doing well. Thank you for having me back. How are you?
All good, thank you, and very, very welcome and pleased to have you back again, sir. Thank you for joining. So I guess in the intro there, we just talked about this backends for frontends pattern, and it kind of relates to the API economy episode that we did before. So maybe set the scene a little bit for us and talk to us a little bit about what is this backends for frontends and why are we talking about it?
Yes, it's a good conversation to have as part of the API economy. There is a certain situation that occurs typically within organizations that are producing web services or APIs, and effectively, the situation is they are typical API developers. They're going through an MVP, a minimal viable product, just to validate, or they may be using monolithic type web services, which are pretty big. And then the org or the company that they work for, they say, oh, we need a mobile kind of application, and we're going to build it. Can we use the existing web service? And most likely they're going to say, yeah, that's a great idea. And they go, okay. And then it goes into production, and what usually happens is it's not quite as performant because we didn't check to see one for different mobile devices. Things may behave slightly differently than other ones, or the radio or the telecommunications of the speed might not be the same because they only tested it in Wi-Fi. So effectively, at the end of the day, um, it's they have to kind of go back to the drawing board. Um, so, for example, if you're not aware, mobile devices use battery when their radio is in use. So that's in essence the big kind of not just context, but kind of the scenario that usually happens.
Gotcha. So I guess then what we're talking about is it's kind of in the name, right? Implied there, but a specific API for the device that we're talking about, really, or talking to, I guess. Okay.
Right, and yes, and so effectively, um, when you have one web service that is a web service to rule all other web services for
Mm,
communication to backend databases, other APIs, or other services, um, that's usually the approach. However, in this scenario, each effectively consumer, you may need to think about it. Do I need to have a different approach? And effectively,
mm,
this design pattern addresses that particular scenario.
gotcha. And is it because of, different data types might be needed or different kind of data representations? Or is it really, as you hinted there, about the medium that is kind of going through? What are maybe some of the factors that, as we're starting to design our APIs, we might be thinking, okay, I've got my brand new shiny service. we've got primarily based for web users and from laptops and whatnot, but actually we want to expand to the mobile market. What are maybe some of those indicators that might make us think this is a relevant pattern for us? Because I guess reading into this, there's probably going to be some downsides to this approach as well. Like, we have to manage multiple APIs which might be doing the same thing, right? So there's some potential challenges with this approach as well, if I'm thinking through this rightly.
Correct. Yes, there are some benefits. There's considerations when to use this pattern and when not to use this pattern. But at the end of the day, it comes down to what does that mean from splitting out either the type of components that can make up that particular back end service to move it into much more of a one-to-one type of relationship. What does that mean from a refactoring perspective?
Exactly.
So there's going to be some cost either way. If you already have an existing backend service and to make this kind of a transition, there's going to be that refactoring cost. However, there may be an upside. Is it much more performant for that particular device?
Gotcha.
Or front end.
Gotcha.
Or front end.
Makes sense. And I guess, I take your point on there's going to be pros and cons either way, because if you had that one backend service to rule them all, as you say, there's the potential, I guess, that you would get this kind of spaghetti code kind of scenario where, you're trying to do so many different things at once in one backend that actually then it's the worst of both worlds rather than the best of both worlds, if that makes sense.
Exactly. And so the solution effectively, as this document describes, is create one backend per interface or consumer, whichever term you may want to pursue, interpret. And effectively, then this will enable new opportunities or additional benefits, such as performance and the flexibility, and we could address some of those areas, such as versioning. If you have a versioning strategy for this typical model for your backend service, both consumers will have the same version. Pretty easy to manage. However, when you start to move towards a backend for front end for each front end, then your versioning model slightly has to be rethought of. So you have a versioning at the front end, and then let's say you have a middle area for data sources or business rules, then you may have to ensure that there is cohesion. And the cohesion allows for those interfaces to continue to communicate.
Gotcha. Because I was going to come back with the response that, Façade may help decouple that in that first scenario where you've got that central backend. But I guess to a degree you can almost mask it a little bit, but fundamentally you're going to be limited by that backend source. So unless you can split it out eventually or whatever it may be, I guess it's almost thinking like a microservice world potentially at that point and unifying requests. But I can see the point actually that a Façade might not fully solve this. It might help ease the challenge to get to the solution here.
Exactly. And the Façade pattern that we talked about on our previous episode, we could start kind of using that for the other parts of our conversation that I would definitely want to bring to light. Keep in mind this back-end from a front-end design pattern effectively started from Sam Newman's pattern, right? And this is back in 2015 when the mobile devices started to become more prevalent and visible within the landscape. And this is when this particular problem occurred. As mobile devices change much more quicker than the desktop app or other consumers, let's say every year, right? There's a new mobile device, there's a new operating system, the radio gets changed from 2G to 3G to 4G to 5G, Wi-Fi capabilities, etc. So it's just, we have to think about things in a little bit more different fashion. And we could kind of go into either issues and considerations or big picture. So, for example, I have worked in an e-commerce company a few years ago. Um, there was a an area where the mobile device and the mobile development team started to go and re-leverage the backend services. However, the approach was, let's remove that operation and data contract and just make it much more agnostic. Think of an object. And then there was interrogations of what is that object? And do I need
Mm.
to go to my mobile area in the business rules or not? And so when you go down that particular pattern or process, you get even worse or further into the weeds, and your technical debt gets in a much
Mm.
worse shape.
Yeah, gotcha. Understand. And I guess the point there, and I can see actually a bit of a spoiler for what I'm about to say, but thinking about the scale of this and the order of magnitude of a problem and whether this is relevant is really going to be how many backends you're going to have, right? Because if you've got like, you know, there's lots of different platforms out there now, right? You've got Android, you've got iOS, you've got different types of devices from different vendors. Obviously, you've got tablets, you've got phones, you've got wearables. This problem of how many backends you have could potentially multiply out quite quickly. So I guess there's a point to deciding how far along you go with this, because there's almost a point of diminishing returns, I guess, to this pattern being useful.
Exactly. And then you have to also think of the operational overhead, testing
Mm,
frameworks, testing methodologies, test execution plans. Yeah, there is. And so effectively, that's one of the considerations is within this document is one, what's a technical debt? Um, First and foremost, implementing a good tooling to understand where is duplication of code. And then there's
mm,
this term called squal, SQALE.
mhm,
What is the quality of the code once you kind of move down this path?
mm,
For me, one area of consideration is as we start using other cloud type services such as Azure Functions or Logic Apps or other things, then effectively you could kind of build out some of those business rules and or other kind of pieces that make up an API and start leveraging more of a micro or nano service type of model.
mm,
And so they could
mm.
be much smaller in composition. It's going to add to the sprawl effect. However, having a good API management structure in place to support what does what and who are your consumers, that is critical as you move
Gotcha.
down this path.
And I think what I'm also hearing then is there are some, and I'm going to bring the D word in, DevOps principles in here as well that really apply. So thinking about how we break up the different components there. So kind of the core logic of that business process. So as an example, we've got one client and another client, and we have the client related code deployed into those pieces, but then we go and leverage some kind of shared library or shared service to actually go and make sure something like this. Yeah, exactly. Then we have that commonality and don't need to reinvent the wheel twice there.
Correct. And so to the DevOps model, right? As you start moving and not necessarily fully decomposing, but just start thinking of who are your consumers of the API and if there's limitations. How do you document those limitations or
Mm,
intended consumers? But that then has to get incorporated into your software development lifecycle and application lifecycle management that you may have in place. So effectively, you don't want to get into a place where you start having too many either upstream or downstream dependencies that
mm,
things become much more rigid. So high cohesion, low coupling is ultimately the desired effect.
mm.
And so if at the end of the day is when to use this pattern, I approach it, when do I not use this pattern? Because
Right.
if you are going to be out of the gate implementing this versus, hey, let me think about this or refactor it when I need to, then that's when it'll be a better approach. In essence, if you only have one interface and you're only going to interact with one backend, effectively one
Yes.
consumer, one front end for one backend, you don't need to worry about this particular challenge. Or if there is the same kind of process or same type of request, at the end of the day, this pattern, it's an anti-pattern.
Right. Gotcha. And I think that's the key thing, isn't it? Is being able to spot those scenarios where it is appropriate and isn't appropriate, because as you say, the pattern can easily become an anti-pattern when used in the wrong scenario. So good to be aware of those challenges and those potential implications of using it in scenarios where it doesn't make so much sense. So I guess so far we've talked about the backends for front ends pattern. I almost hinted a little bit earlier the Façade pattern, kind of being able to split out one backend, for example, into multiple backends and using that as a way to get towards your backends to front ends pattern and that transition. And that has another pattern name, doesn't it, as well, actually?
It does. It does. Before we jump into that, one thing you may want to consider that's not in this particular document is
Yeah,
security,
sure.
monitoring and alerting, understanding certain things. So if this particular pattern does has some considerations with respect to security. In essence, move into a smaller backend, you can have much more granular security monitoring and alerting. But effectively, as you move from this discussion from this particular pattern to, I believe, what you're hinting at is the strangler pattern.
Indeed, I am.
And so this becomes the challenge, right? So if let's connect the dots, just in case people are not quite following along.
Good
We
idea.
have one big backend service for all consumers, whether they be mobile, desktop, etc. And this backends for front ends is to say, let's break it out or refactor it to have one backend to one front end, etc. for mobile or other kind of consumers. There is another pattern called the strangler pattern. The strangler pattern discusses, hey, we have a really big legacy monolithic system. And in essence, it is very hard for us to transition that to the cloud because of the investments made. We as an organization, and I'm using the we as a fictitious development job.
Contoso.
Yep,
Exactly.
Contoso, exactly. And so Contoso has not they tried to get to the market too quickly, and what happens is requirements hasn't quite got flushed out, or they weren't known at the time, so they just built one big application now. And they had started to implement a Façade pattern, and so the Façade pattern allowed the flexibility to say, I am going to start removing or taking things from my legacy system to a newer modern system, whether that be use Azure Functions for nano services, or Kubernetes for microservices, or some other type of compute platform for either. And so the Façade pattern says, hey, don't pay no attention to what the construction we have behind the wall that we see in shops when a new shop is built in a previous shop. And so, but we are actually doing some work behind the scenes, and we will ensure we do not break you as a consumer of our API services, for example.
Gotcha. And I think that's the key piece, isn't it? Is that decoupling? It's that ability for the clients to be able to continue their business as they are. So you'll likely have some kind of legacy application that works in a certain way. The entry point to those APIs and those applications stays the same because of that facade and the entry point. But actually what's happening on the back end, and I think we talked about this last time, actually, the API economy, is this idea that maybe you're translating across different types of web service protocols. Maybe you are using a different kind of authentication scheme or something like that. Maybe even different languages in the backend for all we care. Ultimately, it's about making sure that there's that decoupling between the front end and the back end, and that's what the Façade layer is doing. But then Strangler takes it one step further, where you start almost decomposing, removing from one legacy code base, let's say, and start modernizing that until a point where you've migrated across to that new version. Exactly. I love the mouse movement as we go. That's it.
For visual effect, I don't have my hand gesture that we could use with the camera system.
Exactly.
Yes, at the end of the day, as organizations start to not just transition to the cloud, but say, okay, we brought everything over. Now we're dealing with how do we modernize, right? And so with the modernization effort and with the vast capabilities that the cloud offer, not just from a scale perspective, but the new offerings or additional offerings, when do you go to a particular type of service? These two patterns allow you to explore that and then incorporate that into ultimately your solution. So the mantra I've always had is high cohesion, low coupling. So then you could start interchanging and you could start doing explorations to support, for example, blue green in a DevOps world, canary. How do you validate that? And then you could continue to move forward and not be in a rigid position.
So then when we're thinking about this strangler pattern, what are maybe some of the challenges that might arise there? Because it seems to make a lot of sense. Are there potentially some challenges in this approach? Are there times where maybe it wouldn't make sense for us to go and use? Let's talk about that a bit more.
Yeah, sure. Issues and considerations. If it's hard to read from me sharing my screen, the documents are available online. So effectively, should you have either a situation where you have performance or bottlenecks or effectively a single point of failure, and that is in respect to the Façade, right? The Façade's at the very entry point. So you have to ensure to when you're using the strangler pattern, your Façade does not become the single point of failure for either performance, security, or anything along those lines. And then you ensure the Façade is in keeping up with the migration. So I don't want to introduce a new term, but in ESBs or enterprise service buses had these concepts of a broker. And so effectively, this Façade needs to ensure the request is going to go to either the legacy or the modern during the migration. And then structuring the application so that way there is no breaking changes through this. So regression testing becomes much more critical when you're going through this strangler pattern. And then if the legacy system, right, in essence, I'm speaking to when to use this pattern. When the legacy system is not as complex as you thought, and it will be much easier just to write it from scratch and then leverage either the business rules or some other kind of componentry that you may have.
Gotcha.
So effectively what I'm saying is for small systems, when the complexity is replacement is on the lower side.
Yeah, and I guess what we're talking about with that complexity is maybe in terms of complexity of rewrite or even complexity in terms of a migration. Because if we've got an application where, it's not running for 90% of the month, then we've got a great window there where we can go and fail over. So, is it worth that investment as opposed to the 99.999% available application where actually we can't afford that downtime? That's also what we're talking about with complexity, isn't it?
Correct. Yeah. And what if newer frameworks, right? They force a reevaluation. So for example, .NET Conference 2020 just recently occurred. .NET 5 has some newer capabilities. And if you are thinking about going through this process and the newer framework just supports a much better process. At what point do you do evaluations? Don't go down into analysis paralysis mindset. At the end of the day, you'll organizations will determine, yes, this is the right approach. Obviously, getting speaking to advisors or people that have gone through this process is critical.
Excellent. Good. So I guess we've talked through a couple of patterns there, Peter. We talked through backends for front ends. We've talked through Strangler as well, both related to that kind of API design, API economy. And we also touched upon a little bit the Façade pattern as well. So I guess as we start wrapping up here, is there anything in particular you really want to highlight or call out or just leave people with as that lasting thought?
Sure. In any of these design patterns, just make sure, one, you adhere to ultimately the business requirements and ultimately any timelines, right? In some situations, you may not be able to accomplish the Strangler pattern because of timelines. It might be easier just to rewrite sections of the app. The other is security. In this particular modern day age, with the cloud being available not only to you, Contoso being an organization for the good and benefit, there are threat actors out there that can also take advantage of that cloud platform and perform not so nice things to your environment. So as you are considering this Strangler pattern or any of these other patterns that we will be speaking through these series, is ensure your security, right? What if, as you're migrating from a legacy system that used an older security type protocol, as you move to a modern, that security protocol doesn't come over as newer security protocols are made available.
And likewise, if you've implemented something in that legacy and you're doing the minimum viable product on your modern, you're potentially opening up a new doorway for people to get in as well on the modern approach. Interesting.
Correct.
Good thoughts there. Great. Thank you there, Peter. Really appreciate that. So I guess then that wraps us up for today's session, folks. So we've talked plenty there about different APIs, different patterns, and how you might go and use those. So you know the deal. If you've enjoyed the session, please go ahead, like, subscribe, and share with others that may follow you on your various social media platforms. As we've mentioned numerous times, there are several more episodes to come in this particular series. So we would love your feedback. How's this going? Is this the right level? Do you want more examples, less examples? And do you want us to focus on specific areas in some more depth? And likewise, we're of course going to be carrying on content outside of this architecture series as well. So we'll be carrying on with some of the other concepts that we've been starting on with GitHub, Azure DevOps, DevOps principles, and general technology discussions as well. So again, any interest areas or you want to come onto the show, please get in touch, www.cloudwithchris.com, and we can prioritize that and get you booked in. So all there is to say is thank you for listening in. Stay healthy, stay safe, and we will catch you very soon. Bye for now.